high level here, what is your favorite opera, Heather, and why?
Don Giovanni. I fell in love with it. It was my first real exposure to opera in college. There was still live broadcast going on PBS, our public radio TV station here in the United States, the Great Performers Series, and I saw a performance in about 1977 when I was in college with James Morris as Don Giovanni and Joan Sutherland as Donna Anna. And I fell head over heels in love. I was absolutely obsessed with the score, with the character. I went out and bought the Joseph Krips recording at a New Haven record store with one of the great baritones of all time, Cesare Siepi. On the record cover, he had it was raising a wine glass in toast, and he had a dangling pearl earring. It was just the height of erotic, sort of almost androgynous beauty and power. And the music, the sensual drive, the erotic yearning and conquest just blew me away. And I really had not been an opera person at all up to that point. I knew nothing about it. I was very deeply involved in classical music, but my parents both really reviled any kind of singing. And so I had no exposure to lieder or opera growing up, but this was a life changer. And but it's not as if it turned me immediately into an opera fanatic. I think I went still years before I really started going to a lot of operas. That happened when I moved to New York in the 1990s, and then started going to the Metropolitan Opera regularly. And it had the advantage of being the last frontier for me of music that I didn't already know pretty thoroughly. The orchestral and piano repertoire and chamber music I knew pretty well, and I'm always interested in works that I don't know. So I'm still exploring, and but Mozart to me remains the absolute apex of operatic expression, and for that reason, I no longer go to Mozart operas. Frankly, I am willing to cop to diminishing returns in music. Nobody else is, but I'm going to be quite honest. My 20th exposure to Don Giovanni does not have the same thrill as my first five, and I would rather preserve that musical experience as at as sublime a level as I can. So I don't go seeking Mozart operas. If I have no choice but to see one, I will, and gladly. But right now, I'm still looking for operas I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, a lot to unpack there. I think when you were describing the sort of the erotic nature of just looking at this picture with the guy with the earring and the wine glass and whatnot, I think to myself of being in a museum and looking at really good sculpture. I'm by all means an amateur art critic, not sufficiently well versed in any form of visual art, to be honest. But like, you go to a museum and you sort of you engage in a kind of relationship almost with a really good sculpture or a really good painting, and you have that experience where it can be moving in a way that literature can be moving or film can be moving. And opera is something that I have been exposed to a little bit, but not a lot. But hearing you describe this, I think I'll book some tickets to the Sydney Opera House.
Please do, and it's not just Don Giovanni. You know, if they're not doing Don Giovanni, you've got Nozze di Figaro, Così fan tutte, the great trilogy of Mozart's operas by the librettist Da Ponte. But basically, you know, the standards, you can't go wrong. And you know, it's interesting what you described, Scott, about your personal identification with art and the sense that you are being taken out of yourself, being given an experience that you would not have. And I think all art allows us to inhabit minds that are greater, more capacious, more insightful than our own. It takes us out of our petty, narrow selves. And that's how the experience of art museums was written about for decades. I'm writing about this right now, as a matter of fact. William Hazlitt, one of the great 19th century critics, described his experience both with the British Museum, the National Gallery, and the Louvre, and it being really a temple of greatness. Now, however, that is just the opposite. I'm writing about the most extreme travesty I've come across yet of what I'm calling the betrayal of the guardians, which is the fact of the people that have been given the great privilege of guarding our cultural inheritance and passing it on with love and gratitude, have turned on the greatness that it is their privilege to curate, and are going around telling the world that tradition is racist, oppressive, whether it's in classical music or in art museums. There's a show now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art of a great 19th century, probably the greatest 19th century French sculptor, Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux, centered around a bust, an abolitionist bust, an anti-slavery bust of a black woman still in chains, with the most extraordinary expression of defiance, lack of comprehension, just the emotions playing across her face, the mobility of her pose is quite extraordinary. The Met has decided that this is a bust that stands for white oppression, and that any kind of abolitionist gesture in art is, by definition, simply colonialist and a way of suppressing blacks. It is extraordinary. So your experience of art is being now denied art museums who have turned themselves into anti-racist institutions, and they're all about narratives. They're about foisting a hackneyed, formulaic, jargon-filled, academically influenced and parroted narrative about ubiquitous, unending white supremacy down viewers' throats, and that's doing an extraordinary disservice to our civilization.
I would tend to agree with pretty much everything you just said, and the really ironic part for me is that here you have an artist doing something good, standing up against oppression, embodying enlightenment values of human freedom and John Locke incarnate, and yet that good deed is somehow perverted for it's this really strange rendition of presentism. The same thing happened to Philip Guston. He was a Jewish painter. If you followed that saga, that it was ridiculous. The guy was clearly caricaturing. Anyway, one thing I want to ask you, Heather, and I have written down on my little questions list here, is this is related to the opera side of things, but we can relate it to the art museum as well. I wonder about the degree to which this self-flagellating denunciation and apology that is often put forth by institutions, whether they're museums or they are the academy. At my own alma mater, Princeton, it was pretty funny. The president, Christopher Eisgruber, of who I am no fan, was so busy declaring that the school was systemically racist that they got investigated by the Department of Education. But when you look at these self-flagellating denunciations of, we are systemically racist, we need to do better, this whole gallery, this whole exhibit, this whole system is bad, or the whole system by which the whole classical music operatic system is terrible. I wonder whether people actually believe what's coming out of their mouth. Do you think that these apologies are genuine? Or I tend to believe that a lot of times, whether they believe it or not is second to the fact that they feel that they have to do it. Right. What we had an article on this in Quillat Logic is The Good Death, something it was called Good Death, the Logic of Torture, or something like that, about, don't apologize, don't apologize. But I see a lot of these sort of fake tongue-in-cheek apologies of people apologizing for things that they didn't do. Do you think that these apologies are genuine, Heather?
Boy, that is the mystery. I mean, one looks at these and says, look around you. You know that Ice Gruber, Princeton president, Peter Salovey, Yale. If you have your eyes open for 24 hours on your campus, you can see that far from being racist, every single faculty search on your campus is one long cri de coeur to try to find qualified or remotely qualified underrepresented minorities to hire. You know that your faculty is not racist. If you think they're racist, name some names. Who's discriminating against black students? Fact is, nobody. And yet they go around spewing out these formulaic bromides about racism. And one does wonder what is in their head. And I tend to think that they do believe it. I think that there is a desire so great to be on the virtuous side of history. And we do know that, and, Quillette covers problems of psychology and cognition all the time, that human beings are quite capable of denying the evidence right in front of their eyes in favor of received notions, in favor of self-inflating propositions that elevate their own status. So, it may be like an instantaneous switch between a state of empirical reasonableness and then just going into the other side of actually believing this stuff. Because otherwise, I would think that the cognitive dissonance would be unbearable. And these people are simply too consistent in their rhetoric to think that it's all a pose. And I don't know which is worse, being absolutely cynical and being willing to sell out your institution. I mean, this is why I don't understand why there are not faculty uprisings against these preening college presidents who, when they are saying that this is an institution characterized by systemic racism, and it's not just Princeton's Ice Gruber, it's not just Yale's Salovey, it's at Middlebury, it's at Amherst, it's at it's at University of California, San Diego, Berkeley, everywhere. It is everywhere. When those college presidents say we are systemically racist, they are implicitly saying that their faculty are racist. And I don't understand why the faculty put up with it, but they are absolutely terrified. And the department chairs that make the same claim are even closer to the allegedly racist faculty. That, well, the reason that you've had 3 male finalists in your search for an electrical engineer must be because, and they're white, must be because my engineering faculty, are a bunch of racists. And the faculty just sit there, put up with it. It's really pathetic. These are a bunch of conformist cowards, and they are damaging the possibility of keeping this civilization going, because you are discouraging people from either learning about art, or in the case of STEM, I've been writing about this as well. A lot of people are saying, look, I'm a white male or I'm an Asian male. The odds are against me. I'm going to go do hedge fund or something. And so it's a very, very pernicious trend. And somebody with authority has to stand up and say, we're stopping this fiction that white supremacy defines our world today.
Yeah. There's a lot there. I think one thing I'm always interested in is the degree to which, you talk about conformity. I think you're right in that a lot of these people, Christopher Eisgruber being first among them, do actually drink the Kool-Aid and convince themselves of their own sanctimonious rhetoric where even if there is, there has to be a level of, as you said before, cognitive dissonance reduction. I mean, down trickling down to the department head level, because if there weren't, that's the really, I mean, both sides are scary. That, if someone can convince themselves of delusions, that's scary. But what's even worse is that when someone, and I think to the example of the Soviet Union or whatever, of thousands of people marching in lockstep, trotting out phrases that they don't actually believe. I think what's worse is when people know what they're saying is false, but they say it anyway because they think that they have to. Sorry, it looks like you were going to say something.
No, I just think that's an absolutely apt comparison. And one wonders every day, how do you pull the emergency cord, and when do you do it, and say all signs point towards Soviet Union propaganda? I mean, we really are living a whole set of lies, just patent fictions. Again, to go back to the universities, it's not just faculty hiring. They know that in admissions, for student admissions, they have massive racial preferences, that Black and Hispanic students are being admitted with test scores and GPAs that would be automatically disqualifying if presented by white and Asian students. They know that, and yet, if an Amy Wax at the University of Pennsylvania Law School gets up and says, in my history of teaching here, I have not had Black students at the top of my class thanks to racial preferences and what's known as mismatch theory that Richard Sander and Stuart Taylor have written about. Her dean accuses her of racism without providing the data to rebut her. If she's racist, if she's lying, give us the evidence. And of course, they never do. And it's the same in the area of criminal law or hate crimes. We're all pretending that, and I wrote a piece about this for Quillette, that white supremacists are the perpetrators of hate crimes against Asians. The video speaks for itself. It's Blacks that are going around beating up frail elderly Asians in San Francisco and New York and elsewhere, in Los Angeles. The data tell us that Blacks commit hate crimes at twice the rate nationally in the United States as whites. In New York, it's 2.43 times higher Black committing hate crimes than whites. We're living the fiction that white supremacists in the United States are the source of political violence and domestic terrorism, after having lived through a year and a half of Black Lives Matter riots that destroyed billions of dollars of property, that put entrepreneurs out of business, small businesses, Black business owners in tears. How am I supposed to rebuild? You've torched my building. And yet we have the federal government in the United States dedicated to this lie that white supremacy is the threat, creating an amazing department of misinformation, which has now been disbanded temporarily, but you better believe it's going to be reconstituted at some point. So it is very, very worrisome, and one can only hope that totalitarianism is somehow just not in the United States' DNA, but we're certainly dismantling our concept of the First Amendment, replacing it with this preposterous idea of hate speech causing physical harm to women and minorities. It's pathetic. We're a bunch of crybaby losers.
Yeah. I think, it's like a large exercise of play pretend.
Right.
Is what it is. It's
yes.
It's theater. But not the enjoyable kind. It's sort of like a UNESCO play or something, and then you think, oh, wait a minute, this is the United States.
Yeah, we can't leave after the curtain falls. I know and it gets worse and worse.
I think I don't know. There's a lot. This will be my last question on the university thing, and then in the back half of the interview, I want to get into some opera specific questions, but. I just want to say on the record on the subject of Amy Wax, I was initially quite sympathetic to what was happening with her. Now, I think there are valid questions to be asked, but that's the subject of a different conversation. On the subject of the STEM versus.
Well, let me just respond. I mean,
yeah.
she's absolutely fearless, and she does not pull her punches. She speaks the truth as she sees it, and that is the purpose of a university. And the purpose of free speech is, if you disagree with what somebody says, you go into the marketplace of ideas, you battle it out. And Frederick Douglass understood that free speech is the most powerful tool that minorities have against collective state power. So I would just say that Amy Wax is practically unique in her commitment to her understanding of the world, and people should simply rebut her facts, which they do not seem willing to do. So, but let's leave that aside.
Sure. Okay. And agreed. just to say, one thing that you brought up, which is really interesting, was that kids don't want to go into the arts anymore, don't want to go into the humanities because, they'd rather just go off and work at some hedge fund. I wrote about this. I wrote an article for Quillette called "The Liars Club," looking back on Princeton, about how I saw a lot of my peers basically just trotting themselves off into one of three industries: investment banking, consulting, or tech, and how this is a very common thing within Ivy League schools. And it was really, I guess, strange to look back on. You think that you're taking, frankly, I don't, by any measure, think that my classmates or I were the best and the brightest to bastardize David Halberstam. But you're taking what should be the best and the brightest, and then trotting them off into one of three industries. That's sort of a separate thing. I won't go off rambling. What was the connection you made, Heather, between the way universities function now and kids piping themselves off into finance? Could you elaborate a bit on that?
Well, I was referring to STEM, and I've just finished a piece for City Journal on what's going on in the medical profession and medical education. And in it, I discuss white male students and even white male faculty who are not putting themselves forward, or the white male students. For instance, one guy worked in a cancer lab, and he was the best student. He was a Yale molecular biology and biochemistry Bachelor of Science major, and he was the best lab technician that the head of this cancer lab had. And he applied to medical schools. The faculty supervisor was at that point at Northwestern, and he recommended him to the dean of Northwestern Medical School. He didn't even get an interview. He was admitted to only one medical school. He had extremely high MCATs, that's the standardized test for medical admissions, and a high GPA. And he barely squeaked into a medical school. And so what I was referring to is students that are, say, undergraduates in STEM are seeing what's going on, which is a absolute across-the-board discrimination against white and Asian males in medicine. Everybody it's the usual thing. Everybody's twisting himself into a knot to find black faculty, to hire black, editors, heads of institutions. And so people are saying, I'm not going forward with this. And I've been told that when UCLA, the dean of medicine opened up, and there were highly qualified candidates who didn't even put their names forward because they didn't have the proper demographic characteristics. As for the arts and classical music, what worries me the most there is not so much, well, yes, I mean, you're also going to have people that are not going forward because, again, you're not going to get funded. I know classical music organizations now that are run by, say, a non-American, a Russian woman, but she can't get funding. If you do not have if you don't rewrite your entire mission statement to be all about anti-racism, or if you don't have black members on your board or in your staff, if you're a small early music organization, this is, groups that are playing Renaissance and Baroque music, trying to recreate how that music was performed when initially. And this is a very elite, rarefied subspecialty. Blacks have only started going into early music very recently. But if you don't have black musicians and blacks in your staff and blacks on your board, you are not getting funded. And so what bothers me is that students that might possibly at one time have said, okay, I've grown up listening to rock music, but I will give Beethoven or Bach or Chopin a try. I will keep my ears open to a, at this point, extremely alien musical idiom that is almost absent entirely now from our circumambient culture, but I'll listen to it. Instead, the only message that they're getting from the very guardians of this tradition is that it is defined exclusively by white supremacy. And so you're giving young students an excuse to say, oh, I'm not going to listen to that. Why should I? And be participants in this oppressive tradition. The reducing of composers as varied as Handel, as Couperin, as Scarlatti, as Dvorak, as Janacek, Prokofiev, Stravinsky, to say, here's what's relevant about them. They're all white males, and therefore they all go in the same basket, is preposterous. Yeah. Every one of those musicians have completely unique voices, and yet you have the League of American Orchestras, you have heads of music schools saying the relevant characteristic of my tradition is its whiteness and its maleness.
Yeah, it's extremely reductionist, and it's not just unfair, Heather, to white students. I think, as you pointed out, it's grossly unfair to young black burgeoning musicians, because no matter how good they are and how hard they work, for the rest of their careers and the rest of their lives, there'll be a little asterisk behind their name. And no matter how well they perform and how good, people will always say, "Oh, well, you only got into this academy because of your pigmentation. You only this or that." And so it's not really fair to black students either. And I would think that young burgeoning black musicians would have the same reaction as the white students of saying, well, I don't want to go into an industry where people are gonna, always say, well, you only just got this because. And so you're stripping the classical music of both white and black students. And it's like, it's just totally, a lot of these adopted policies, and you've written about this obviously, are 100% self-defeating. You're not addressing the root cause of an issue. You're making up, you're creating an imaginary issue that doesn't exist in the first place, and then applying solution. It's like you have a wound, right? And you put the Band-Aid up on unblemished parts of your skin. It's like there was no wound there to begin with. But just go ahead. Yeah.
There are many blacks who do acknowledge the stigma of racial preferences, but there are also many who still say that the reality is, to be black today, you have to be 3 times as good as to be white. Or and also, your hypothesis was, well, if you go forward in a system that is now characterized by ubiquitous and vast racial preferences, people will say, there'll be an asterisk next to your name, or they'll say the only reason you're here maybe is not because you were the best, but because you were the best black, which is an idea that a Yale law professor Stephen Carter wrote about in the 1990s in a book called Reflections of an Affirmative Action Baby. And he quite honestly confronted that problem. But many people do not. And you cannot say that publicly. If you do raise any doubts about somebody's credentials, that, well, how do we know that this was a merit hire and not a diversity hire? That's a suicidal statement. So I don't think that the fear of being seen as a diversity hire or a preference hire is necessarily that discouraging to people. I think what is worse is to send the message that you will be discriminated against in this profession, which is, again, as you say, we are living a lie. Every single symphony orchestra now is programming, putting black compositions, whether Florence Price or the equally mediocre Chevalier, the Joseph de Bologna, on the program, or contemporary black composers, and they are doing everything they possibly can, short of tearing down the audition screen, to hire black musicians. And certainly in soloists, where you're not auditioning behind a screen, they're also getting hired right and left. So the idea that classical music is a racist organization today is another one of these massive lies that people are going around promoting to the detriment of our civilization.
I guess just to get into a bit of humor here, could you describe the whole Fidelio debacle to us? What, I mean, just succinctly. Because I don't think a lot of people necessarily appreciate the ridiculousness of the whole thing. So could you describe what happened here?
Well, there were two issues I wrote about: the Fidelio, Black Lives Matter Fidelio, and then also the Beethoven's Ode to Joy rewriting. So Fidelio is Beethoven's only opera, very much of Enlightenment opera about freedom. It's about a woman that goes undercover in a prison as a boy, prison guard or prison assistant, to try and free her husband, who's being held in a prison without any kind of due process by a despotic Spanish ruler. And she manages to finally free him. And it's heart-wrenching, because Beethoven was single all his life, had difficulty connecting with people, and certainly with his deafness made it even harder to communicate. But this is an opera not just about freedom and the human spirit, but also a paean to marital love and fidelity. So the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is not an opera house, put on a Black Lives Matter version of Fidelio that reset it in a contemporary supermax prison with alleged Black Lives Matter activist who had been thrown into prison because he was investigating corruption in the prison criminal justice system, and he was writing his PhD on the 13th Amendment. And so they rewrote all of the spoken libretto to have just completely irrelevant comments about blacks being gunned down on a daily basis by the police. And I mean, it had nothing to do really, except for a prison narrative about the actual opera. And of course we had to get in some gender bending as well. This time it wasn't, the wife was not undercover as a male prison assistant. She was simply undercover as a female prison assistant. So one of the secondary love interests in the opera is now a lesbian love interest rather than a heterosexual one. And we really suspended our disbelief because, and all the singers were black except for of course, the Spanish despot was still a white guy, of course.
Yeah.
But the biggest amazing kind of get this suspension of disbelief was that the father, the black prison guard who was the father of another woman who worked in the prison, who was a lesbian, he was encouraging his daughter to go after this new female who just showed up. And, let's just be honest here. One of the groups in American society with some of the highest levels of lingering disapproval for homosexuality is blacks. The rate of anti-gay hate crimes is much higher there. So, this was, again, completely counterfactual. But then you also had, around that time, the conductor of the Baltimore Symphony, Marin Alsop, who engaged in a project to have everybody rewrite the choral ode that ends Beethoven's Great Ninth Symphony, that is based on a ode by Friedrich Schiller that's been known as An die Freude, is what it is in German, to joy, and we know it as the Ode to Joy. And this is one of the great matchings of text and music in the history of music. Beethoven set a romantic work that is filled with German idealism and ecstatic sense of unity with creation, and a 18th century yearning for freedom, which was not the norm in the 18th century. You still had despotism and lack of democracy. So Marin Alsop said, okay, enough of this Schiller guy. We're sort of sick of it. So she commissioned this Baltimore rapper who goes under the name of Wordsmith to write new lyrics to the Ode to Joy. And they are worse than a Hallmark ode. It's filled with all of this, pablum about let's fight for gender equality and, be diverse, and let's all join hands and be for climate change and stuff. And it's just ridiculous. And there were others she commissioned in England that were equally ridiculous, sort of more mannered in their rhetoric. The Wordsmith version for the Baltimore Symphony at least sort of parsed a little bit as verse, but it didn't match the music. Beethoven had worked very carefully with the meter of Schiller's ode to match his music, and you had this Wordsmith, trying to cram 5 syllables into one note. So as just sheer musical rhyme setting, it was just appalling. But to think that you're going to have people that are going to hear Beethoven's symphony perhaps for the first time, and that are being denied the experience of hearing it as it was meant to be written. It's just ridiculous. And she's not licensed to do that. But it's all this pathetic effort at relevance. Again, a music director who does not have the language or the confidence in her heritage to make the case for new audiences to come in. You don't have to rewrite it by Wordsmith. Make the case that the pairing of Beethoven and Schiller is unique, it's not replicable, and we should be grateful for the fact that its rhetoric is sublime. It's not how we write poetry today. That's not a failing, that's a feature, not a bug. This thing is never going to be written again. Schiller's not coming back. Nobody's writing in that idiom of the German sublime, and that's precisely why we should be down on our knees in gratitude for this cultural moment that is long gone. And how about we, as products of the 21st century, with all its democratic banality, How about you just try and enter a very, very different aesthetic world?
It's a good point. People often will say, well, why do I need to read Shakespeare? Why do I need to, learn about Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, whatever? It's, that's totally irrelevant to me. That guy was hundreds of years ago, or, and it's like, it doesn't need to necessarily be immediately relevant to, I mean, it is, to be honest, it is relevant to everything that's going on. But yeah.
No, it's not. It's our attitude today is one of absolute narcissism. If it's not about me, if I as a female don't see myself reflected in some literature as a female, it's somehow not relevant. Or if the author is a male, I mean, this is just, it's pathetic. It is shallow, narrow, and people are cutting off their human experience. We're going to die. That is facing us. We have a finite number of years to try and experience the great vastness of what it is meant to be a human being. And the only way we will do that is by getting out of our pathetic, narrow selves and exposing ourselves to great art. It is an escape from the self. And instead, this idea that it has to be relevant, and as you say, truly understood, of course it's relevant. It is humanity's greatest expression. But again, students are being encouraged by their professors to say if they don't see themselves reflected down to the latest minutiae of gender identity in a Aeschylus trilogy or a Wordsworth poem, that they are licensed to reject it. It is a extraordinary betrayal of what these professors have been hired to do, and that they're failing to do now. And that it goes as well for symphony orchestra directors, for opera directors, for museum directors. You are all failing, and you should be replaced because you have betrayed the one thing we are asking you to do, which is to curate these traditions and to teach new generations why they should be down on their knees in gratitude before these magnificent, monumental inheritances of human sublimity and beauty.
That's very eloquently put. I wonder whether I live in Australia. I'm American. I grew up in New York. In the degree,
I can tell.
The hat gave it away. But one of the things I like about, I mean, this is a whole larger. I'm very grateful to be an American and have an American passport, and I still think it is an amazing country. But one thing I appreciate about being in Australia is that a lot of the play pretend doesn't exist here. It was funny. I was in Miami last week with, not last week. This was like a month ago, with an Argentinian friend, and we were talking about issues, and she was just like saying very blunt but accurate. She was stating very blunt but accurate observations, and I was like, you should keep your voice down. You can't say that here in America. And she's like, why not? She's like, it's not racist. She goes, I'm not even American. She goes, I'm not white. I just say whatever I want. And so she's like, you guys are so concerned with being called racist or being called that. If the wall is blue, call it blue. That's it. But I want, as far as the assault on the arts, are we seeing this in other countries as well, or do you think that it's a uniquely American phenomenon? Perhaps not uniquely American. Obviously, we've seen, great art torn down by all kinds of autocrats throughout history. But right now, in liberal Western democracies around the world, are we seeing this kind of assault on visual art, on music, and on affiliated types of things?
Yes, absolutely. Britain, all of Great Britain is absolutely turned inside out over this. You had half of the members of the English touring opera in Britain fired because they were white. You had the Arts Award, a nomination for the Scottish Opera for its production in early 2020 of an opera by John Adams called Nixon in China, which had been universally lauded by critics. And then this obscure arts institution organization in Britain called, the acronym is BEATS. It stands for it's basically a British East Asian arts organization to represent Asians. They complained that two of the Chinese characters that were cast in Nixon in China, Mao and Zhou Enlai, were played by white singers, even though Richard Nixon, this is about Richard Nixon's groundbreaking visit under Chairman Mao to go to China. Nixon was played by a black baritone. This is typical, it's only one way. So it's assumed that blacks are going to sing white roles, but if a white sings a non-white role, that's a problem. So Beats, this guy that ran it, sent out a little tweet saying, "Oh, this is yellow casting, and you can't cast whites to sing Asian roles." They withdrew from their arts nomination. A British Labour MP went after them. They issued the most craven apology. This is happening everywhere, and in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, one of the great world museums of all time with the greatest collection of the Dutch masters. It has Rembrandt's great Night Guard canvas, massive canvas, but just astounding Vermeers and Frans Hals and Rembrandts. It has now gone around rewriting its wall texts to show that somehow a Dutch Baroque still life, with gorgeous tableware and peeled lemon and oysters, is actually all about colonialism and racism. And this rewriting of wall text is happening everywhere. The Tate Modern in Britain put on a Hogarth show, and it invited in these lunatic American academics to write wall text, complaining that on a mantelpiece was white porcelain in one of Hogarth's social satires, and therefore this is all about the ugliness of white and white fragility of porcelain because it's white. I mean, it's everywhere. And believe me, it is coming to Australia. You guys are not immune. It is the Anglosphere in particular. I don't know what it is about Anglos that are so guilty, but it is coming to Australia. It's going to be driven by, I'm sure you've got land acknowledgements there, for God's sakes.
Left and right.
The indigenous.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's coming. And frankly, your COVID policies show that you've already been taken over by females, which is the kiss of death. I mean, the safetyism that you guys exhibited during the worst of your COVID lockdowns was beyond anything I ever would have experienced, and shows that our non-Australian concept of Australian liberty and libertarianism needs to be radically revised. So given what you saw in COVID, again, it shows that you are becoming a feminized culture, and the race stuff is sure to follow in its heels.
Well, when that happens, I will grab my passport. But
there's no place to go.
Yeah, that's also true.
I would say, like on Continental, Macron, to his credit, Emmanuel Macron, the newly reelected president of France, he has said, we're not tearing down any statues here, so don't even think about it.
Yeah.
And they haven't gone after Voltaire and Racine and Rousseau yet. We'll see. I mean, several years ago, some obscure UN agency was bitching and moaning about Dante's Inferno as homophobic and Islamophobic because he had some Muslim in one of his circles of hell. And at that time, this was back in 2012, there were various Italian academics who said, "Are you kidding me? This is our patrimony. Just shut up.
Yeah.
Come on." But I'm not so sure it's not going to start happening there, because when it comes to opera productions, Germany is the absolute worst. They're the leaders in something called Regietheater, which is director's theater, which resets operas in contemporary settings, kind of like the Fidelio, the Black Lives Matter Fidelio, but worse. That wrenches operas out of their original context and meaning to set them in contemporary modes to serve as just vehicles for the director's own adolescent political hobby horses. So that's happening throughout European opera stages, and so I think the more explicit race stuff will probably start happening there as well. And it should also be pointed out that, every other artistic tradition is also racially monolithic. I mean, nobody complains that Chinese opera is performed by Chinese people and African Nigerian drum language is performed by Nigerians and is not white. It's only, again, the double standards are enormous. It's only white traditions that are blamed for their demographic past.
Right. Well, not to. I want to be respectful of your time here, Heather. So I just ask one concluding question: is where do we go from here? I mean, the arts, as you've said, are our cultural inheritance. It's not just classical music. It's painting. It's visual art. It's opera. It's all of Western civilization. And there seems to be this sort of, I mean, you've referred to this as classical music suicide pacts in one of your City Journal articles, and I think suicide pact is a good is an apt coining, because it doesn't have to be this way. We're doing this to ourselves. We are tying ourselves into these knots. So if a suicide in French, the verb is se suicider, like you do it to yourself. So we can stop. But how do we stop? How do we untangle ourselves from this web? And what would some practical solutions be to this assault on the arts, Heather?
Courage, conviction, principle, love, a sense that anybody in the arts world who has a job, you've given your life to this. It's on your shoulders to keep this from going down. Every day that you're silent and the racial extortionists continue to dominate your field, and I'm talking about you, Simon Wood, head of the Symphony Orchestra Association. He's an absolute a disgrace how he's going around tearing down. And I'm speaking to you, classical music press, BBC New Yorker, Alex Ross, all of you, Anthony Tomasini, who are going around repeating this lie that classical music today is racist. You are destroying an institution that is already on the ropes. The San Antonio Symphony just recently last week declared bankruptcy. They can't keep going. And every year classical music is more and more marginalized by our culture. It was not the case in the 50s and 40s. You are traitors to greatness. And anybody that has any voice has to stand up against this. Every day that we're silent, we can't. And you're absolutely right, Scott. The driving motive of a lot of that's going on in our society, as your Argentinian friend in Miami saw, is race. We are terrified about racial disparities. I have a book coming out called The Danger of Disparate Impact, which is that we have decided to tear down every meritocratic and behavioral standard in Western culture, because those standards do inevitably have a disparate impact on blacks, whether it's meritocratic hiring in medicine and STEM, that has a disparate impact because of the vast academic skills gap, or criminal law standards of, laws against theft, of murder, of shooting, of gun possession, resisting arrest, rioting. All of those laws neutrally applied, constitutionally applied, without racism, do have a disparate impact on blacks. Not because the criminal justice system is racist, not because police officers are racist, but because black criminal offending is exponentially higher than that of whites. And we are terrified of that gap. And instead, we're going around, as you say, voluntarily, deliberately accusing ourselves of phantom racism rather than looking at these gaps head on and being willing to say, that is the problem. It's not the standards at this point. It's behavior and skills and culture. And as long as we turn our eyes away from those behavioral determinants of disparate impact, it is all coming down. Every day, another institution is under attack. And so we have to be willing to defend this civilization and speak the truth. And more people just have to get strength and courage because, we're living a lie, as you say, the Stalinist example of people going around that should know better and possibly still do if they have any shred of connection to reality left, and they haven't simply brainwashed themselves into the big brother lies. They have got to speak up.
One would hope so. And one would hope that, not they have to, certainly, but one would hope that they will. Anyway, Heather, I think you're a terrific example of someone who is speaking up. I've always admired your work, which I've been following for years, and it's been a great pleasure to have you on the show. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much, Scott. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.